And we're live. Hello and welcome everyone to the Against the Stream podcast, where we take a weekly look at world events and analyze them from a Marxist perspective. My name is Hamid and Alizadeh. Today I'm here with Niklas, Albin, Svensson, and we are from the International Secretariat of the Revolutionary Communist International. Welcome to the show, Niklas. This is your first time in.
Thank you.
So let's dive into it. This week we've had a lot of things happening, and I thought we could start with the events surrounding Joe Biden giving permission to Ukraine to fire long-range missiles into Russian territory. Now, this happened. The reports about this started appearing on Sunday, where the White House basically announced through secondary sources, not even openly, that they were clearing one of Volodymyr Zelensky's main demands, that he be allowed to fire long-range missiles into what is Russian territory before 2014. And in particular, we're talking about these ATACMS missiles. And on Tuesday, we saw the first salvo of an attack with long-range missiles. And yesterday, we saw Britain and France following suit, allowing the Ukrainians to use their Storm Shadow missiles also on Russian soil. Now, just to say, why is this significant? This is a huge deal. This is a massive escalation of the war in Ukraine, because this is as opposed to other arms that the West has given to Russia. Here, for the first time, you have the use of arms against Russian forces inside of Russian territory, which can only be used with the direct assistance and involvement of American personnel for intelligence purposes and navigation purposes and so on. Americans, in other words, have to be involved in attacking Russia. That is the facts of the matter. And the Russians, Vladimir Putin in particular, has made it clear a long time ago that this is a red line, i.e., this amounts to a significant escalation of the situation, because and that the Russians would see this as an attack by America and NATO on Russia itself. That's how the Russians would define it. Now, just before we go into the discussion, just thinking about it, you've had these weeks following Donald Trump's victory. There's been this hysteria about American democracy under threat. You have a fascist, lunatic, a dictator moving into the White House.
That's what they claim.
That's what they claim. Yes, that's what the traditional media claims. That's what the mass media, the state apparatuses and the governments throughout the West, and that this person is dangerous. He's armed and dangerous, in other words, and that he has no respect for democracy, right? For democratic rights and bourgeois democracy. Now, let's leave that to one side and look at what's happened here. Here you have Joe Biden, who's a president who's hated by the vast majority of Americans. He was rejected by his own party. He wasn't allowed to stand for president. His party was resoundingly rejected by the American voters. Donald Trump won the elections, amongst other things, on a clear mandate to end all of these wars, in particular the Ukraine war, which, again, probably a majority of Americans are now against. This is a war, and we'll get to this, that a majority of Ukrainians want to end as soon as possible. There's a new Gallup poll that we'll discuss later on, which says that 52% of Ukrainians want negotiations now. And instead of listening to all of these that's what democracy is about, is the majority rule. This person in the White House has chosen to massively escalate and towards what could be a devastating conflict, potentially devastating conflict with Russia. I mean, that's just.
I mean, I think that's how they conduct themselves all the way throughout this war. They've constantly had this escalating, constantly lies and distortions in order to try to justify the position, starting with the war when they entered into the war in the first place, claiming that Putin wanted to conquer all of Ukraine and all these things, denying, which was the fundamental reason for the war, that they were trying to expand NATO, or at least introduce all kinds of new weapons into Ukraine. Western weapons, Western military systems, and so on into Ukraine. And every step of the way, they deceived people basically into supporting this war.
Also to stand up against Putin, the dictator, the anti-democrat.
That's right. Well, defending the slogan was, we need to defend the right of Ukraine to join NATO. They had no intentions of letting Ukraine join NATO, but we have to defend the right to join NATO. That was the slogan. It's about the national sovereignty and the right of Ukraine to join NATO. That's what they said. Now, obviously, they've forgotten the original reason. They're hiding that one, but this was what was said when the war started. And I think it's and now we're back, basically another escalation, which Biden, and because people are now starting to see through it, they can see, one, that it's clear that Russia is winning. So what's the point of keep fighting? Where the outcome is now basically written, and so what is and people are seeing through some of the lies and so on that have been peddled over the last few years, and what that is the response of Biden, but to once again escalate the conflict. And now you see Russia today this morning or during the night, they responded by sending an ICBM into the continental ballistic missile, not with nuclear warhead, but with some other type of extremely destructive warheads that have now hit Dnieper overnight and caused big damage.
Yeah, exactly. I will get to that in a moment, but I actually wanted to stop for a moment before on what you said before, that this attack, there's been a lot of reasons mentioned for this. We need to support Ukraine and, to fight, stand up against Putin's empirical empire building ambitions and so on and so forth. And that now we have these North Korean troops, you see. We have North Korean troops in Ukraine. So we need to attack him with these weapons. But here's the thing. First of all, there's no evidence so far been provided that any North Korean troops are at the front lines in Ukraine. We're not saying that they don't exist, but there's no evidence actually been provided. Secondly, Putin, according to Putin himself, Russia has more than 800,000 troops now actively involved in Ukraine. So why would they so desperately need 10,000 more Korean troops, which they say? They might be there for some reason, for training purposes or whatever, but that this should play any significant, decisive role in the battle is completely nuts.
I think the Korean shells would have played much more. North Korean shells that they sold to the Russians would have played much more of a role than these soldiers would have if they are there.
Exactly.
If that's what we're being told. I think it's the South Koreans, which is the source of most of this information. And one suspects there's a South Korean, the latest quote about the involvement of North Korean troops on the front line in Kursk is from a South Korean lawmaker, like a parliamentarian in South Korea. And obviously the suspicion is here because South Korea has been staying out. They've got stockpiles of ammunition that have not been sent to Ukraine. And in the end, they sent some to the US, and then the US sent some others to Ukraine, etc. But they've not really, the US have been pressurizing South Korea to take an active part, or more of an active part in supporting Ukraine against Russia. And so suspicion is obviously that this story is being spread by South Korea in order to justify them taking a bigger role in supporting Ukraine.
Yeah, and it's been spread by Zelensky in order to whip up hysteria, and Biden in order to whip up hysteria and justify these missiles. The other reason that let's just stick to this. First of all, they said that they were going to allow the Ukrainians to use these in order to, basically because they're South Koreans in Kursk region. But the actual places that these missiles have been used have been in Bryansk, neighboring
Yeah.
Kursk, which is nowhere near, and on ammunition depots and other places which have nothing to do with South Koreans.
Or North Koreans.
Sorry, North Koreans. I'm sorry about that. Apologies to the listeners. The other reason, supposedly this is supposed to help the Ukrainians, but the fact of the matter is, these missiles, they have relative power, but they're very limited in number. They're even more limited in the numbers that they're given to the Ukrainians. Some people talk about 50 or maybe 100, but in that kind of range, let's say it's even 500, but it's not a significant.
Yeah, I don't think it is 500 at all.
No, it is highly undoubtedly.
They estimate 50 or 60, which would mean that they could do. And this attack on Tuesday, they involved six.
Yeah.
And this I think they have publicly said, and 6 of them, which would mean they could do 10 of these salvos.
There you go.
And
that's supposed to bring down
down
Russia.
The Russians shot down 5 of these,
Yeah.
possibly damaged the 6th one.
Exactly.
But it's quite clear that one ammunition depot was hit.
Yeah.
So if we're talking about if the same ratio continues to 10 ammunition depots that they can hit, and I mean I don't know how many ammunition depots they've hit with drones and other things, it's not going to change anything.
Exactly. It's not going to change anything. You have a situation that we've discussed it several times on the podcast, but the rate of acceleration of deterioration of the Ukrainian defenses is massively going up. You have several important cities being either surrounded or where the Russians are preparing for big attacks. You have in Kurakhove, you have Novoselivica and Pokrovsk, which are very, very important areas. The Russians are making inroads in Chasiv Yar, another very important gateway into the final areas of Donetsk that the Russians don't control. In Kupiansk, again, another very important city, the Russians have made huge inroads, possibly being on the verge of surrounding tens of thousands of troops in the Kharkov region of Ukraine. And the Ukrainians are helpless to stop this onslaught. In fact, there's a even in the Western press, where usually there's always this jubilant mood. No, the Ukrainians are fighting back. It's funny. I talk to a lot of people who are not politically on a daily basis. They're not really political people. And whenever you talk about Ukraine, they say, oh yeah, they're really the Russians are not doing very well. They're really being being defeated in Ukraine, because that's the image that's being portrayed. But now, even in the mainstream media, there's an increasing realization where this is going. The BBC had an article which is called "Ukraine Front Could Collapse as Russia gains accelerate," experts warn. And it says here, according to the Institute for the Study of War, the Institute for Study of War data shows that Moscow's forces have seized around 2,700 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory so far this year, compared with just 465 square kilometers in the whole of 2023, a near 6-fold increase. Now, I just want to add to that according to the Financial Times, at least 1,200 of those square miles were just in the past 1 or 2 months. In fact, probably you go to August and July, the vast majority of that is a massive acceleration in the advances of the Russians. And then they have a defense researcher who I think is quite perceptive, because I've seen her speak on this in other places. She's from King's College London, Dr. Marina Miron. She suggests to the BBC that there was a possibility that the Ukrainian Eastern Front might actually collapse. These are her words, if Russia continues to advance at this pace. Now, the question that comes up is this. Here you have an unstoppable onslaught by the Russians. You have weapons that cannot have any effect on this. You have an American population which has rejected this policy. You have a Ukrainian population which has rejected this policy, and yet you continue to provide this, even though the Russians have said many times that this is a red line. Now, in the West, there's a lot of signs that, oh, the Russians have had many red lines. But the fact is that the two main red lines they had was one, Ukraine and NATO, and this one. This was the hardest red lines that they presented. And when the Americans refused to withdraw a possibility of Ukraine joining NATO.
Well, another red line they had was invasion of Russian territory, which
is also
escalated the conflict when Zelensky, when the Ukrainians went into Kursk.
And we know for a fact, this is, again, we've commented on this in this podcast, Biden, quoting in his in this biography of his recently, this was in the FT, we can find it again later, he says, I think Zelensky wants to pull us into World War III. He wants to force a direct confrontation between US and Russia. Now he's doing the same thing.
Yeah, well, how far, I don't know exactly what it goes on in Biden's mind or why he does what he does. I think it's
probably Biden doesn't know that either.
That's quite possible. I think it's quite clear that the only way Zelensky could win the war was by dragging the West further and further into the war. Mm-hmm. But I don't know if you say in Zelensky's defense is maybe the wrong way of putting it, but the truth is as well, back in April 2022, so 2 months after the beginning of the conflict, or a month and a half, whatever it was, it's about a month and a half into the conflict, Ukrainians and Russians were sitting down and negotiating, and they were going to come up with an agreement. Well, there was a draft agreement which might even have been signed by both sides, which involved Ukraine not joining NATO, obviously, and certain other provisions, recognition of certain territories like the Donbass, Mariupol, and so on, that they would be under Russian influence. I don't know exactly details of that, but more or less. And this was the deal that presented then after just a month and a half of war and so on. And I mean, the amount of deaths, that is basically today, when they're looking at the deal, and that's coming up now, it's going to be worse for the Ukrainians, significantly worse for the Ukrainians than what they were presented with at that time.
Exactly.
And so all the deaths and destruction, and that deal was on the cards. Zelensky had agreed to it, but then we had the West stepped in the form of Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of Britain, who went down to Kiev to promise the Zelensky that they were going to give him all the support they needed in order to win the war.
Yeah.
So the idea was, with the help of the West, they were going to beat back the Russians, and they're going to, and then you can see the consequence of that. Basically, the West scuppered that deal, and I'm sure Biden was well aware of what Boris Johnson was doing at that time, and who else was involved, who knows. But this was the West deliberately provoked not just the war in the first place, but then the escalation of the war into this massive destruction of Ukraine, as well as Ukrainian soldiers, Russian soldiers, Ukrainian civilians. The economy of Ukraine's been destroyed. All of this was deliberately created. Deliberately created by the West in order to try to weaken Russia.
Yeah, let's actually look into that, because you actually sent me an article to use today, because a few days ago it was 1,000 days of the war in Ukraine, and we had an article. I believe it's in Reuters, if I'm not mistaken. I forgot to write down where it is. Yeah, it's in Reuters. It says what Russia's invasion has cost Ukraine as war reaches 1,000th day. Now, I would say this article is quite conservative and mild in its assessment of what's happened. This is the Biden side of things, the establishment view of the destruction, right? And what are we talking about here? It says, apart from direct casualties, which number in the hundreds of thousands, and they don't show that. They talk about 31,000 men. This is a complete nonsense. But it talks about, apart from direct casualties, the war has raised mortality rates from all causes across Ukraine, caused the birth rate to collapse by about a third, sent more than 6 million Ukrainians fleeing abroad to Europe, and displaced nearly 4 million inside the country. The United Nations estimate that Ukraine's population had declined by 10 million, or around a quarter, since the start of the invasion. That's just the population. You stop me anytime if you have any comment, but I'm going to continue in this article.
Finish.
Yeah. Then it talks about the shrinking of the Ukrainian economy. that despite growing last year, Ukrainian economy apparently grew last year. It's still only 78% of its size before the inflation. That's 22% decline in the economy
since 2021.
Since 2021, end of 2021. Then it says that the World Bank, European Commission, United Nations, and the Ukrainian government found that direct war damage in Ukraine had reached 152 billion as of December last year. That's 1 year ago. It's been quite a lot of, in fact, probably more valuable in terms of value. This destruction has happened since then in the attacks against the energy sector and so on. He says, with housing, transport, and commerce, industry, and energy and agriculture the worst affected sectors. The total reconstruction is estimated at 486 billion. That's 2.5 times higher than the GDP. The power sector, they say, oh, the power sector has been particularly hard hit, but they don't give the fact is about 80% of the power grid is now more or less not functioning, and that could increase massively as we go into the winter.
It is an important part of the whole question now, right? I mean, we have all this destruction and misery that's caused by the war itself.
Yeah.
And we should remember as well that Ukraine is one of the poorest nations in Europe.
Yeah.
After the collapse of the Soviet Union, which was a calamity of warlike proportions for countries like Ukraine, with the GDP fell dramatically, and it never recovered. So the GDP of Ukraine in 2021 was roughly the same as it was in 1991. So here you have a country which has been absolutely devastated by the restoration of capitalism. And as though that wasn't enough, now they've had to suffer 3 years of war, 2.5 years of war, which have completely destroyed the country even further. And now this reconstruction bill of $400 billion. And the question is, 500, who's going to pay it?
Exactly.
I mean, basically, Trump wants to get out of the Ukraine war. I mean, I'm pretty sure he will make some kind of deal with Putin. He will get out of it somehow. Whether he will wait for the Ukrainians to sign the same deal, or he's going to leave them hanging to fight on their own. We don't know. But he's not going to pay $400 billion to rebuild Ukraine. Biden is not going to pay $400 billion. No. Is Europe going to pay $400 billion or $500 billion to Europe? Can barely fund its own development of its own economy. Can it fund the reconstruction of Ukraine? Are they going to make the Russians? This was one of the ideas they have, of course. They're going to make the Russians pay? Well, they're not. Putin is not going to pay. He's going to say, well, you caused this war. Now you pay. You pay for the reconstruction. So the misery of the Ukrainians have really only begun.
And I would say, add to that, one thing that these figures don't show is the cultural destruction of Ukraine. Ukraine was a very advanced country, even in spite of all the poverty and misery that was inflicted on it after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Ukrainian people had a very high level of culture, very high level of education, very high level of literacy, very, very deep cultural traditions of literature, of art, of ballet, of music, all these kind of things. And that's one of the costs of war that is probably it's the most barbaric, but it's not measurable in these figures, because you have a country that's been destroyed, a whole generation which has been crushed, lumpenized in many ways, left for themselves, and is being pushed back decades in reality. And it will take decades and decades for Ukraine to overcome the blow.
I mean, they will now step in, and Zelensky has basically given an offer to the West. Yes, come in, give us money. In return, we're going to give you these assets, these mines are going to be yours. You're going to get these state-owned assets and so on.
That was Zelensky's so-called victory plan.
I mean, that is what's. I mean, maybe some American investors will go in. They'll buy. Yeah. I mean, the agriculture of Ukraine is very profitable, so for sure they can go in and do something there and so on. But they're not going to reconstruct. They're not going to get $500 billion out of this. The general crisis of capitalism is not such that there is a huge amount of capital to be
And incidentally,
spent on this kind of thing.
Zelensky's victory plan, I think we've covered this as well in the show before, but he basically offered to give all of the mining and the natural resources of Ukraine to the West, and also for the Ukrainian army to be used as a mercenary army to protect the eastern flank of Europe. Where is independent Ukraine in all of this? Ukraine would become.
Yeah.
I mean, if that's not a sign that Ukraine is a puppet state, is a proxy regime aimed at Russia on behalf of Western imperialism. I don't know what is, but let's just continue for a moment, because the impact of all of this. You see, in the beginning of the Russian invasion of eastern Ukraine, the mass of the population went behind the regime. In fact, that's one of the main things that Putin miscalculated, because he believed that there would have been more support or more open receptance of the Russians. However, we have our technician giving us a bit of saying Niklas should be a bit closer to the mic. But when the war started, a chunk of the population went behind the regime, and that actually that was what stabilized the regime, partially, one of the reasons why the regime stabilized. Now, in a latest Gallup poll, which was published a couple of days ago, I can't find the exact date. There is an article on Gallup's website called "Half of Ukrainians Want Quick Negotiated End to the War." Right now, here it says that in Gallup's latest survey of Ukraine, conducted in August and October 2024, so that's in the last quarter, an average of 52% of Ukrainians would like to see their country negotiate an end to this war as soon as possible. Nearly 4 in 10 Ukrainians believe their country should keep fighting until victory. Now, that is a big shift, and I'll tell you how big the shift is, because Ukrainians' current attitudes towards the war represent a decisive shift from where they stood after it began in late February 2022. Surveyed in the months after Russia launched its full-scale invasion, Ukrainians were defiant, with 73% preferring fighting until victory. So we have almost a halving of support for a fight until victory. And for the first time, we have these. I mean, I suggest people go and look at this article, because the graphs are incredible. For the first time, you actually have a majority which says we need a negotiation. We need to stop the war, and we need negotiated peace now. Fatigue is setting in. People don't believe that. I mean, we've said this from the beginning, that this war was unwinnable from the point of view of Ukraine, but now that reality is sinking in, and you contrast this reality that we can't win this war. This is an unwinnable war, and we can't take this anymore, with Joe Biden's action of launching a massive escalation of the conflict by allowing this. I mean, it's just mind-boggling, really, to think about.
Well, it was abundantly clear, I think, is that Joe Biden is not least bit interested in what Ukrainians think or what their interests are, as in the average Ukrainians. I mean, he probably does have some interest in Zelensky, but he doesn't care about the average Ukrainian workers, farmers, and so on. He doesn't have their interest at heart at all. Yeah. And this has been abundantly clear from the start of this conflict. I would also say this is before Trump's victory, this opinion poll, and obviously the realization that support from the US is going to disappear is going to have put even more, make these figures shift even more in that direction.
Yeah. Now, just to say, an interesting part of this poll is that you see, before the main opposition to the war was in the east of the country. It was Russian speaking. It was a part of the country which was also most ravaged by the war, but it was Russian speaking. There was a general more open attitude towards Russia, whereas the base of the regime was in the west of the country. However, here it says, and in Kiev and in Lvov and in all of these cities, the city dwellers there, that was actually the base of the country. Just to add to that, also that the main people drafted into the army were not from there. So the regime was basically leaning on. A lot of people talk about in Ukraine. They talk about the Kiev, the people who go to clubs and cafes in Kiev. They were the main base of the regime, the right wing, middle class people in particular. However, it says some of the biggest declines in support for the fight have been in regions far from the front line, including Kiev, down 39 percentage points. Kiev is that's a huge decline, and the West down 40%. The Western Ukraine has always been far more hostile to Russia and to this and supportive of the war than the Eastern war. Among Ukrainians living in the east, in the country's east, more than twice as many people now want the war to end as soon as possible, 63%, rather than continue, 27%. Now these are that to me must spell panic in Kiev, in the Zelensky government, and also in the West, because what then are they going to base this war on? If collapse is crumbling in the areas that are not affected, then what must morale? Sorry, is morale is crumbling in those areas? What must it be like at the front line?
But that is a real thing. They're having serious problems now with desertion.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's been a little bit of that for a long time, but now it's really becoming disobedience, desertion, and so on. Naturally, the soldiers are looking at the situation and saying, why are we sacrificing ourselves for this? The war is coming to an end. We can see it's coming to an end. And why are we then being sent off to face like Russian drones, Russian artillery, being resent to capture some bombed out buildings that are why are we defending these husks of buildings and so on when we all know how it's going to end?
Precisely.
So why am I putting my life on the line for this?
Exactly.
You can see what's the dynamics that is developing,
and the question that must be asked in the context of our discussion today is, if that's the case, why is Joe Biden continuing escalating the conflict, continuing, in fact, his actions, if anything, in my opinion, Niklas and I have a slight difference of opinion here, is geared towards disrupting a potential conflict, disrupting the ability to come to sit at the negotiation table by trying to provoke Russia into doing something that's rash, which would make it more difficult for someone for an American to take a negotiation standpoint and to make a compromise with Putin.
I don't think that he does have the power to stop an agreement being made.
He does not. He does not.
I don't think he does. And I find it to be hard to work out what he's actually planning. The best thing I can come up with is that he's trying to strengthen the hand in the negotiations, strengthen the hand of Zelensky, also vis-a-vis Trump. I think you're right about that. He's trying to strengthen the hand of Ukrainian vis-a-vis Russia and vis-a-vis Trump. But I don't think it's going to have much of an impact. Also because everyone can see the direction things are moving. The Russians understand, although this is one of their red lines and all this language that they've used, state of war and other things that Putin has said, they understand the way things are going. And so although they will draw their line in the sand, they will respond.
Yeah,
but they will not in a way that is really gonna change the situation.
No.
The way things are, but they don't want to change the general direction which things are going, because it suits them very well.
Okay, well, on that note, I think we should continue. That's a good segue to our next segment, which is Donald Trump, which has been in the headlines many times in the past few weeks, and it's not disappearing. Now, one of the things that one of the things that I've noticed is the liberal hysteria about the election of Donald Trump. There's this guy called Edward Luce. He's the Financial Times U.S. editor. He is a particularly interesting, funny person to look at. He's actually quite comical the way that he's winding himself up. He says, "Rome was not destroyed by outsiders. Its demolition was the work of barbarians from within." Right, and that, of course, he's referring to Donald Trump. Although, as Marxists, we know that Rome collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions and not the individuals who came to power at this or that point in time. But the point is, he's been appointing or nominating a series of people for his cabinet, and everyone have been trying to figure out what this means. But the main thing that the mass media in the West have been focusing on is the background of these people, who is unconventional to say the least. Now, just to go over a few of them. First of all, we have Pete Hegseth, who has been nominated to head the Department of Defense with $1 trillion budget, the biggest part of the U.S. budget. That's the Pentagon, essentially, the U.S. Armed Forces. Now, this person is an ex-soldier, but he has no political experience. He's a TV presenter in Fox News, and
It's a good CV right there.
That's a good CV. He's quite clear in his opinions. He's anti-woke. He's anti-trans in the army. He's anti-gay people in the army, as far as I believe. He's anti-women in the army.
He thinks that the U.S. military have been losing wars because they're too woke.
Because they're too woke.
Because they allow gay people, and also because they will prosecute the soldiers for war crimes.
Yes.
When they commit war crimes, like in Abu Ghraib and so on, that this is a sign of that when you then prosecute them. Basically, you should allow the soldiers to commit war crimes. That's the way to win a war.
Yeah, precisely. And the one thing that he's promised is that he will set up a warrior council, as he calls it, a council to go through all of the top commanding officers of the U.S. Army one by one, and the ones who are woke, he says, but in reality who are not, who stand against Donald Trump's position, they will be weeded out. Now, this, in my opinion, is the red thread that you see through a lot of these nominations, the vast majority of them. Then you have Matt Gaetz, who is set to become the Attorney General, the head of the Department of Justice, who is a very controversial figure. The only thing that the media has been talking about him is that he has a series of sexual abuse allegations leveled at him that he's been investigated for. When you read the normal media, you can't find anything else about him than that. But the way I see it, well, there was a report in.
No, that's not.
There's a report in a website. I think it's called the Bulwark, where they quote certain Republicans who were close to Trump when he was finding his candidate for Attorney General, and whereas the others were mainly focusing about their legal background and how they view the Constitution and so on. Matt Gaetz reportedly said, "Yeah, I'll go over there and start cutting fucking heads, right? I will go and do a purge," because this is a very important position for Trump. Trump has been attacked, through lawfare, as they call it. Has been under investigation for a whole series of crimes. Probably he's committed them, but he's been prosecuted as a part of a political campaign.
When you compare the treatment of Trump to the treatment of Biden, and his son, Hunter Biden, and all the scandals that Hunter Biden has been involved with, and how that links to Biden, and then you compare that treatment of Biden in the context, and you compare to Trump's scandal, Trump treatment, you can see.
Exactly.
It's not that Trump is innocent, but it's the fact that they are going for Trump, whereas they're not going for the others.
Precisely. And so here you have someone who is loyal to Trump, and not only who will exonerate Trump or who will shut down these cases, which are already being shut down, by the way, but also who Trump can maybe use against his own enemies, such as Biden, Hunter Biden, and all of these gangs, and the Department of Justice itself, which would have a series of people in there who would be working against Trump. And then we have Linda McMahon, who is the owner, I believe, or the founder of WWE, World Wrestling Entertainment.
Yeah,
and who is
it's an entertaining choice.
who's going to head the Department of Education, which is, again, and what has been her program? One, chartered schools, i.e., private schools funded publicly, but also what she says, sending education back to the states. What does that mean? If they've been hinting at shutting entirely down the Department of Education, and meaning that the individual states could determine their own curriculum, which would give more power to in particular to the, to the more Christian, religious, reactionary, Republican states out there. But significantly, again, a purging of the state. And you go through all of these. I don't have time to go over all of these, but you go through every single one of these. Robert Ford Kennedy, is it Robert? What's the F stand for? RFK, JFK's was it grandson, something like that, grandnephew. Anyway,
yeah.
Robert FK, let's call him that.
Robert F. Kennedy,
who's taken over the Department of Health, launching what he says a war against the FDA, against the bureaucrats within the FDA, saying that he's going to cut out big business, big health, big pharma, all of these, big pharma and all of these big food, as they call it, from the U.S. state. Tulsi Gabbard, who's going to head all of the intelligence agencies. She's an ex-Democrat who went against Biden for provoking the Ukraine war. She was against the U.S. involvement in Syria and in the Middle East in general. And she's going to head what's called the charge against the deep state. And I think when you look at all of these different nominations, there are also other nominations like Marco Rubio and so on, who are more traditional conservative. But the majority of these have one thing in common, which is that they are preparing a purge of the state apparatus, which is something that Trump realized last time around when he was president, that yes, you can change the president, but the president is not necessarily the person who makes the politics.
Well, I mean, the truth is that you basically have a split in the state, a split in the ruling class, and where the state now is becoming a battleground. The traditional way of the state functioning in a capitalist society is that it's a tool of the ruling class to be used maybe primarily against the left. If the left prime minister or something comes in, trying to implement, like, for example, if Jeremy Corbyn were to have been elected prime minister, the state would have worked against him to make sure he couldn't implement his program.
Yeah.
And in a similar way, they've used the state against Trump when he was president. Now, there's nothing left-wing about his program, but they were trying to use the state in order to stop him implement some of his policies that went against the interests of American big business. Not in favor of the working class, but they were against the American big business. And as a result, and they came into conflict. The lawfare, like you said, for example, the use of the courts, the Justice Department, and so on, in order to try to persecute Trump, I think is a correct phrase to use. And now, obviously, they turned politicized the whole of the state apparatus. And Trump is now basically coming back and saying, well, in order for me to implement my program, the first thing I got to do is to root these guys out who would otherwise be stopping me from doing what I want, which is tariffs. It's tariffs and tariffs.
And more tariffs. Yes. Well, Donald Trump's program is Donald Trump. That's I think the main thing, and then some tariffs.
The wall, attacks, deportations, these kind of things.
But the point is, I think, as you say, the main point here is, as opposed to the idea that's normally preached in schools and so on, that you have a state that's above all divisions. It's a neutral state that represents everyone, all of the layers and all of the classes of society, and is just and so on. And you have a technocratic state apparatus. In reality, as Marxists, as communists, we realize that's not the case at all. That's never been the case. In fact, the state is a reflection of a society that's divided in classes. And in normal times, in the vast majority of time, the state is a weapon, is an institution for the oppression of the majority and of their subjugation to the will of the ruling class. That's what the state apparatus is there for. And in the US, what you have is essentially an organism. This state organism has been a continuous organism existing at least since going back to World War II, the whole of the post-war period. Millions of people, the state apparatus, the state bureaucracy, never been elected by anyone, never being held accountable to the American population, following their own, and in particular the interests of the dominant wing, or of the American ruling class. That's what and the Democrats and the Republicans were a part of that organism. As one organism. They had their own differences and so on, but in reality, they represented fundamentally the same interest. Now, Donald Trump comes from the same class. Donald Trump is a capitalist. He's a billionaire. We all know that. He doesn't hide that. But he is now outside of that establishment, outside of that organism, so to say, and he's waging a fight against it. In fact, part of the reason why he's so popular amongst the working class stands up and he speaks his mind again, and he fights against these people. He takes on the deep state, and that's one of the things that they can't forgive him for. That's precisely one of the reasons why this struggle is being fought, because he's exposing the system. He's exposing this lie that the media is neutral, that the courts are neutral, that the police is neutral. He's like, no, it's not. You're using it. And I'm showing you how you use it, and I'm going to use it as well.
Well, the truth is that they're exposing themselves to some extent.
Precisely.
Like, for example, when they, I think Trump bragged about the fact that when they convicted him for this crime, which was to basically electoral fraud of some sort, right?
Yeah.
Of misusing electoral funds, I think it was the crime that he was convicted of. His support increased, and this was his best fundraising day.
Yeah.
Up until that point, where he raised like $36 million in a day or something like that. So I think this battle has exposed the state for what it is, which is a tool of the dominant wing of the ruling class to try to implement his will. And it's all linked to the fact that in modern democratic, in capitalist democracy, you have the universal suffrage. That means workers can vote. So how are you going to prevent these workers from basically voting in a government which represents their interests?
The true interests.
Yes. And you have the parties, which is one way of preventing this from taking place. You have an electoral system which very much biases these two parties. But then you have also the state apparatus, which is there to try to create inertia, prevent people implementing policies. You have the press as well. But the state apparatus to stop any kind of change which goes against the interest of a capitalist class.
I mean, you go and elect some representatives. First of all, even in America in particular, you can't become a president if you're not a billionaire or have billions of dollars behind you. But you elect a few representatives in a bourgeois democracy, but the vast majority of the state apparatus is never elected and is never held accountable. Now, and that's what he calls the deep state. It is a thing. The state bureaucracy does exist and has certain interests and is connected to the class interests of a certain class. In the majority of cases, is the main parts of the ruling class. Now, there's an article in the Atlantic. It's quite interesting. The Atlantic is very, very concerned about what Donald Trump is doing, but they kind of inadvertently admit to what's happening. He says They have an article on the 11th of November called "There Really Is a Deep State," right? But they say this is a very good deep state.
Yeah.
Whether you know it or not, you've likely seen this deep state in action. It was the reason Trump's preferred treatment for COVID during the early phases of the pandemic, hydroxychloroquine, was not flooding pharmacies, and it was why COVID vaccines were not rushed out before the 2020 presidential elections. Both of these efforts were stopped by civil servants despite overt pressure from Trump and officials in his administration. Now, they've taken a case which probably the majority of people would think, yeah, Trump was wrong on that, and he was misinforming people, and so on about COVID and about taking these drugs.
Is that the deworming drug?
I can't remember. Yeah, it was whatever it was. It was absolutely non-scientific. However, that is what actually happened again and again during Trump's presidency. The state apparatus maneuvered to box him in, to tie him down. For example, when he was trying to withdraw from Afghanistan, there was a concerted effort to make that happen slower. That he didn't actually finish it in his term. Biden finished it, and then he did a real mess out of it. In the Middle East in general, there were constant attempts by the Pentagon to tie him into one conflict after another, whereas it was that he didn't want to. That's the reason why he's now putting in place his own loyalists and opening a war. Because if he's not to be sucked in by the swamp of the state, he needs to have it. But that's not an easy struggle to fight. That's not an easy one to come up.
I think also there's there's a kind of, among a certain wing of the Trump movement, there's this idea of like a small state, or a small state, like a libertarian wing, represented by people like Elon Musk, and so on.
Yes.
Who really would like, who has the illusion, I think, that they can slim down the state, save lots of money for slimming down on the state bureaucracy. But the truth is that the modern state is not something you can't just turn the clock back to the 19th century and think, oh, we're going to live with the state of 19th century today. But the modern state in a capitalist society has grown into a massive parasitic outcropping on the economy. It's a parasite on the economy and on society. But it is because of the development of capitalism, in the inability of capitalism to function in the way it used to, that it has developed these monstrous proportions. It's not because of some policies, and there's no way that Trump and Musk can just go in, even with the best of intentions, maybe, but even with the most determined will, they cannot curb the state, and you'll find that I'm sure they will sack people at the top and so on. They will make some changes at the top, put more pliable people in charge who will be more yes men, who will say, whenever Trump comes up with a very strange proposal, they'll say yes, 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 and it'll be easier for him to implement it. But fundamentally, they cannot change the state apparatus, which is far bigger than any precedent.
Yeah, but the point that he's highlighting is actually that democracy doesn't work. You elect someone, that person, you say now, oh, he implements some yes men. Surely, in a neutral state with an elected government, the state apparatus should be yes men, in the sense that the state apparatus should carry out the will of the elected leadership of the country. But what he's showing is that that's not the case at all.
Yeah.
Now, one thing that I think this scenario reminds me of is when Erdogan was elected as president in Turkey. He had the same situation. He had a state apparatus which was dominated by the old traditional ruling class, the Kemalist wing, that founded modern Turkey in the 30s. They had a whole series of parties, very similar to, in some ways, similar to the US, that lots of parties essentially representing the same organism, the same dragon, a multi-headed hydra, you can say, being in power, and then in the 90s, one after another coming in one government after another, one party after another, representing the same establishment, going into crises, the situation, conditions of the working class being undermined again and again and again. And then Erdogan, as the person who was untested, who could come in from the sidelines, not having been embroiled in any of the scandals, and then talk about democracy, talk about working class rights, talking about the rights of the poor and so on. And he actually rode to power on a massive wave of popular support. But then what happened was that he had to fight a struggle against the state apparatus for more than a decade, in fact. And in that struggle, what he did, we know Erdogan is a bourgeois. He represents, at that point, a junior wing of Turkish capitalism. But what he did was that he actually appealed to the masses and brought them on several occasions onto the streets when the army was plotting coups, or when different parts of the state were maneuvering against him. Use that to strike blows against the old state apparatus. Now, we're not saying that that's necessarily the scenario here, but what it is that there's the development of an irreconcilable or a very, very sharp division and a sharp conflict, which is going to play out and which is going to lead to increased instability, and it's going to expose the U.S. state for,
I think
for what it is.
In that sense, also it's important to if you think about not just what's going up between Trump and the state and so on, but also what role does the working class play? What role does the revolutionaries play? What role does the trade unions play? I think the pressure will be on in such a circumstance for in this battle between the Democrats and the Republic of Trump, effectively, for then the unions and the workers, or the unions or the organized labor movement, to come in on the side of the Democrats in this battle to defend the establishment effectively as the lesser evil and so on.
That's what they tried to do so far.
Precisely.
Not really working anymore.
And so obviously this is a decisive question: on whose side should the trade unions come in and so on? And obviously we are not on either of these sides, right? We're not on the side of Trump and we're not on the side of Germany. We should not allow ourselves, or the workers or the trade unions should not allow themselves to be used in this game. But class independence will become extremely important in this coming period, to maintain independent class position, for the working class to have put forward its own interests rather than being subsumed into this battle between two wings of the bourgeois state.
Yeah. But exactly, now that actually leads us to the next point. Next segment we wanted to make, which is continuing from this, because when you look at Trump's administration in general, the coalition that he's basing his support on is quite a varied series of people. You have, on the one hand, you have the Christian ultra reactionary right wing Christians. The evangelicals and all of these types. Then you have a layer of the middle class who is highly libertarian. They're being crushed under the weight of the crisis by American big business, and it's what Trotsky called the enraged petty bourgeoisie in some ways, and who are feeling the squeeze very, very harshly. You have a layer of lumpens, of declassed elements, of people who are just rotting away, this small layers of Nazis and really, really far right extremists and reactionary types. Then you have obviously a segment of the traditional Republican Party, but I think that's kind of the least consequential part in this equation.
A lot of them went to Democrats.
Yeah, a lot of them, exactly. Then you have the billionaires, like Elon Musk, and the millionaires, like I keep forgetting the guy. Anyway, the guy who's going to head the Department of Government Efficiency with Elon Musk, the world's richest man, but a maverick billionaire. You have Peter Thiel, another billionaire. You have Mark Andreessen, another billionaire who's giving quite a lot of support to Trump. You have these Wall Street hedge fund managers who are all like, bring down all regulation. Vastly different people with different interests. And then you have a significant chunk of the American working class, which is what brought Trump over the line. That's what got him elected, right? I don't know how big a part of his support base it is, but that was the decisive part that won the elections. It was a question of class.
In places like Pennsylvania,
All of the
crucial.
swing states, all of these, areas, these old industrial areas, or still industrial areas, but with a declining industry. Now, the class question, everyone has realized that the class question was a decisive one. Class and war, perhaps, were more than anything, the class question was the decisive question in this. And now, in hindsight, everyone is kind of reorganizing their analysis and admitting to this. And what you had was the Democrats running a campaign, a very arrogant campaign. We had a comrade, Antonio Balma, visiting London. I was talking to him yesterday. He said it was almost like it was detached from reality, like a jubilant, festive campaign that, things are so great. But
and lots of pictures of Kamala Harris.
Kamala, I don't know what we're going to call
Kamala.
But I mean, we've presented some of the facts in the podcast before, but just another one. There's an article in, there's a study made by Investopedia called "The American Dream Now Costs $4.4 million," right? Dollars. And it talks about, I'm just going to quote, the average bachelor's degree holder in the US earns about 2.8 million during their career, with women earning 2.4 and men earning 3.3 million. That's a gender gap. According to Georgetown University Center on Education and the Workforce Analysis of the US Census Bureau's American Community Survey. Okay. When looking, that's the average of now far from a majority of Americans hold bachelor degrees. Certainly none of the working class people, or very few of the working class people. When looking at the data by household, the average US household of 2 earners holding bachelor degrees has lifetime earnings of 5.6 million. So you would think, okay, if you have a bachelor degree, at least you can still achieve something. Because according to the same calculations, to reach the American dream, i.e., within the estimated average lifetime to achieve the things that are, a house, a car, 2 children, the old dream, that would cost you 4.4 million. You would think, okay, that's reachable. However, the 4.4 million is only a part of the overall cost of living. Other important costs to consider would include food. Food is not included in this. Healthcare, which is a huge part of the bills of ordinary Americans, auto insurance, and other baseline necessities that are not included in Investopedia's American Dream calculation. So here you go. The vast majority of Americans do not have bachelor degrees, but even if you had, actually reaching the so-called American Dream would be a reach, right? And then it goes into all of the different aspects. Retirement says in order to have a comfortable, decent, not a very luxurious, but a decent retirement, you need to start saving from the day you finish college, from 22 until you're 65, and you need to save up $1.6 million in retirement savings, right? Now, he says the reality is that many Americans don't hold retirement accounts at all, and those who do have accounts don't have 1.6 million in them. About 54% of American families hold retirement accounts, according to the most recent survey of consumer finances from 2022. So 54% only have retirement. You need that at least, right? The average amount held in the retirement account by 55 to 65-year-olds is 185,000. 185,000. That's the amount we're talking about. That's what people actually have if they have a retirement account, and they need 1.6 million. And it goes on and on and on and on. It talks about housing, like home ownership, and it says in order to get a home, an average home costs $1 million. Now, how many Americans is a minority of Americans who can even get a mortgage for $1 million that they'll be able to pay off by the time they're 65? It's impossible. And that's the situation that led to the victory of Donald Trump, because Trump appealed to this. Now, this is the final member of Donald Trump's coalition. right? But the point is, can he satisfy all the needs and demands of this coalition, of the the rednecks and the Christian fundamentalists and the billionaires and the petty bourgeois who want deregulation and no unions, the billionaires who want to crush the unions and who want to undermine the minimum wage, and at the same time the working class who feel they're suffocating, who feel they've been betrayed, who feel like they don't have any future to look forward to other than an ever increasing grind, an ever harder and harder grind.
I think this is the classic thing of a demagogue, right? So Trump is a classic demagogue, and you can see it particularly in this election campaign, which I think was even more so than the previous one. His thing is turning to workers. He says, "I'm on the worker side." Vance, his vice presidential candidate, was picked because he was already a bit of a demagogue, and he's trying to basically it's all things to all people, right? Except the Democrats. But he wants to be everyone's friend. That's his solution to the problem. His solution to all the problem is stop immigration and tariffs. This is going to solve the problems of everyone, right? This is the idea that he presents, which is nonsense. It's not going to solve any such problem. Tariffs is going to put once again pressure on inflation. Which
is already doing that actually. Like a lot of retailers are front-loading shopping and they're raising prices because they're afraid of tariffs.
Yeah, so it's already putting pressure. I mean, the UK not affected directly, but you can see the inflation now is edging upwards again in the latest figures. And he is thinking that this is going to solve the problems, basically promote class peace. He's thinking that his program is going to basically harmonize relations between the bosses and the workers, so to get them to get together more. And but in fact, it's going to have precisely the opposite effect. Driving on inflation is going to once again put more pressure on the workers that they need to fight, need to go on strike in order to win better wage agreements in the collective bargaining negotiations and so on, provoke strikes. And what position is he going to take there? I suspect he's going to be a bit vindictive, and if one particular capitalist has been against him, he might be more sympathetic towards the workers if they support the Democrats in the election or something like that. But in general, and Musk most certainly, who is now one of his main right-hand man, are not sympathetic to workers, and they will then come into conflict with these workers who are demanding a bigger share or to maintain their living standards. Basically,
that's the point. You see, that's the whole point, that capitalism is not reactionary by choice. Does not stand in opposition to the interests of the working class by choice. That's what a lot of reformers would like to say. That's what a lot of liberals would like to say. Oh, it's a political question. We just have to prioritize working class people a little bit more. But the fact is that within capitalism, the different classes have contradictory and directly opposing interests.
Yeah.
And you cannot satisfy all of them. Now, it's interesting because one of the comments here mentioned that we were talking about the fact that there's an element of Bonapartism in the way that Trump is acting, in the sense that he's leaning on different classes. And I went to have a look at Marx's The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, which is a text that I recommend all of our listeners and viewers to study, to understand a lot of what's happening in this period. Now, Trump is not exactly a copy of Louis Bonaparte, but there are definitely similarities. And one of the parts, he talks about how Louis Bonaparte is promising one thing to the industrialists, promising one thing to the peasants, promising one thing to the petty bourgeois, promising one thing to the middle class, to the workers, and then he very similar. In fact, I mean, it's too long a quote for me to read out in full, but it's very similar to what Trump is doing, promising everything to everyone. And then Marx says, Bonaparte would like to appear as the patriarchal benefactor of all classes, but he cannot give to one without taking from the other. And that's the point, that in capitalism, the interests of the proletariat, the struggle is essentially a struggle for the surplus value created by the working class. and who has to reap the benefits of that? Who has access to that, and to what degree?
Well, it's notable how many CEOs is in his picks of like all the people that he's picking are rich people, right? There's not a worker in his pick, not a worker, not even a union leader among all his picks for these positions. So you can see when push comes to shove and he has to pick between the profits of his mates or the salaries of workers, be they in Pennsylvania or Arkansas or wherever, I think it's quite clear that in the last analysis is going to stand on the side of the billionaires.
Well,
but his attempts of his program, right, basically is to try to resolve this contradiction by pushing the contradiction abroad, right? So this is the central point of his tariffs, his protectionism, his isolationism, is trying to basically export all the social contradictions into other countries, European Union, into China. Basically, rather than having a revolution and class conflict in the United States, you export the problems into China and Europe so that they can have their social problems instead of it being in the US. But it's not going to work, basically, partly because these places aren't just Europe and China aren't just going to sit back and allow him to get away with whatever he wants, and partly because it's not going to be enough to solve the massive contradictions that are in American society.
Precisely. Although I would say, when we're talking about Bonapartism, these are very, very peculiar phenomena which reflect the extreme tensions of building up in society. And you could see a situation where Trump temporarily would lean on parts of the working class against even the bosses. We've seen that, with other Bonapartist figures like Putin in Russia, and even Erdogan to a certain extent, gave concessions to the working class, in particular the workers in the poorer workers in eastern Turkey and so on. But obviously, in the last analysis, he bases himself on capitalism and on the basis of the interest of the ruling class. But
there is a good quote by Trotsky. Trotsky says that the strength of finance capital is not such that they can appoint any government at any time to do their bidding. The strength of finance capital is that any non-proletarian government, any government that doesn't actually abolish capitalism and introduce socialism, any such government in the last analysis will have to defend its interests.
Precisely.
But this question, obviously, there's a bit of a difference there between the immediate direct control of finance capital and in the last analysis, as in the last analysis, Trump will have to defend their interests.
Precisely.
But there is some scope of maneuvering between those two things, which is where he finds himself.
Precisely. And we've said before, what we see here is there's a process that's been developing in America since 2000, going back to 2008, with the election of Obama, which Obama was a man of the establishment. However, he was put in place in order to channel a rising rage and anger that existed underneath the surface of society against the status quo.
Against Hillary Clinton.
Exactly. He talked about change. And in people's eyes, change meant fundamental change. And Jordi, actually, a comrade who's often here on the show, said that he talked about hope. People wanted hope. People don't have any hope. And they had to go through 16 years of the school of the Democrats to realize, the American working class had to realize that there's no hope and change within the Democrats. Quite the contrary, the Democrats themselves are representatives and the executors of this system. Now you have the rise of Donald Trump, which reflects the rise, the anger and rage, that, and the disappointment with the Democrats and with the establishment. He's not a part. He's kind of a maverick, and he's peculiar. He's not under the control of that establishment. But nevertheless, he doesn't reflect the interest of the working class either. Unfortunately, what happened was that in this period, there's no one. People like Bernie Sanders betrayed the movement when they had mass support, huge support on the basis of putting forward the demands of a revolution against the billionaire class and so on and so forth. But Bernie Sanders betrayed. He caved in. He endorsed Hillary Clinton, the enemy of the working class.
Yep.
And therefore, the baton was kind of passed on. And Trump, who is a clever guy, he's a reactionary, but he's an intelligent reactionary, picked it up And for now, he's going to run with it. And just like we said that the American working class had to go through the school of the Democrats when Barack Obama came to power, now the American workers will have to go through the school of Donald Trump. But in this process, you also see the process of maturation of class consciousness, which is, and the crisis basically revealing the system in a higher and higher degree to the working class, and setting the stage for even more, how do you say, immense social explosions in the future.
Yeah, I think that is very much the way things are heading. I think the next year in the United States is going to be an extremely turbulent year with battles and struggles on all different kinds of fronts within the state, battles between Trump and all the things we mentioned. There's also Trump and the central bank. There's a battle brewing there between him and Powell. There's a battle between Trump and the military establishment, Trump and the foreign policy establishment. But obviously, then the battles which is going to have to take place between the classes, like we saw in the case of Boeing. Yep. Just the hard-fought struggle, where the workers won important concessions. Not everything they were asking for, but they won important concessions in that battle. The strike, which lasted, I think, over a month in Boeing. And they got significant concessions on the part of bosses, which just shows what power the working class has when they're really militant and determined to fight, and fighting a little bit even beyond the union leaders who were prepared to sign the agreement much earlier. But the workers fought on, and they won an important victory.
Absolutely. And I think with those words, I think we can end the show today. It's been a great show, a great discussion. Great to have you on, Niklas.
Thank you.
And we will be back next week, same time and place. Hopefully, we actually wanted to do a show about the world economy today, but then things happened. But I think we will do a special episode about the world economy with Niklas. He's been following that for a long time now, and has lots of insights that would be very interested to discuss, and for our listeners. To all of you out there, thank you so much for tuning in. We'll be back next week. Please help us by sharing and subscribing to our show. And again, if you have any suggestions for topics to discuss, articles to discuss, please write them. We do listen. We do read all of the comments that people leave on all the different platforms. And yes, I think that's it. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.